park and then a football field and all kinds of stuff. So I had a lot of good experiences on the sports side, but also just playing as a younger kid on the playground equipment and that kind of thing. And so a lot of fond memories.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, David. We'll go to you, Jasmine.
Hello. Hi, good afternoon.
Yes.
A park that I remember, hmm, I don't necessarily say I do have a park, like a lot of parks in my neighborhood, because I'm from La Puente,
Hmm.
but a park that's like a little bit further from my city is Avocado Heights, and that's where they have horses, and people could go there and ride, or like the community is so nice enough that they'll let you borrow the horse to ride, or you get to meet new people.
Nice. Thank you for sharing, Jasmine. I see Claudia has written in the chat. Hello, my name is Claudia in the Whittier Narrows Park, which is 5 minutes drive from my house. This park is memorable for me because my family would spend time Saturdays or Sunday during the summer to barbecue or just lay to relax during the afternoon. And we also celebrated a lot of family birthdays there. Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Claudia. Let's go to you, Nestor.
Hi, can you hear me? All right. So my neighborhood park would have to be this one called Don Avi Cerritos Park. It's in Cerritos. It's relatively big, and it's one of my favorites because it has like a variety of different sports you can play. So every time I go, I'd either play soccer, basketball. Um, Growing up too, they had a big playground, so I would use that. Play with my friends and my siblings. But yeah, that's the part that I grew up with.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Esther. We'll go to you, Jorge, and then we'll go to Chase, Gil, and that is Jorge Ramirez. You might
You hear me,
still be
guys?
on mute,
Sorry.
Jorge.
Oh, okay. There you go. Sorry about that. My favorite park probably growing up was Field of Dreams in West Covina. I grew up playing baseball, so it was a lot of fun playing on smaller versions of the MLB parks that we saw on TV.
Nice. Thank you for sharing, Jorge. Chase.
I would have to say, I don't have the specific park name, but back in Sacramento, it was a local park next to my house, and I just have a lot of memories of going to the field to play soccer and also playing on the PlayStation.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Chase. We'll go to Issy and then Rocio.
The park, I grew up in New York, and there was a park on the west side called Riverside Park where we would go play soccer. I remember that really fondly.
And New York is very massive. I'm learning so much more about New York as I've gone over there to explore a little bit. But what part of New York did you live in? Were you in one of the boroughs or were you in upstate?
It was in one of the boroughs. This was on the Upper West Side in Manhattan, though. So there was a big soccer league that would play in Riverside Park. So it was really cool to get to go down and see. It was a really beautiful park.
Awesome, awesome. It's really interesting in New York because you have all this concrete, especially in Manhattan, and then you have these oases of green space that pop up out of nowhere sometimes. Thank you for sharing. Rocio? I see you wrote in the chat, Rocio. My name is Rocio, and my favorite park is Winchester Park. That's like 30 minutes away from Temecula, mainly since it was 10 minutes away from where most of my families live. Many childhood memories with my cousins, especially during the summertime. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Rocio. Carla, and then we'll go to Melissa.
Hello, my name is Carla. Um, favorite park, I would say Tidelands Park in Coronado in San Diego, just because over the pandemic, we did so much paddleboarding, and that's where you get up nice and up close under the Coronado Bridge. So, yeah, quite a sight to see.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Carla. Melissa.
Very good. Oh, sorry about that. Let me get that up there. One second. Okay, I think it's on. Okay, there it is. Okay. Okay. I wrote about the park that we used to always go to. Let me turn off my phone. Across the street from Puente Hills Mall. It's in Rowland Heights. It's called Shabaram Regional Park. So when I was little, we would my grandparents owned their own pharmacy in town, and then we'd go to the mall or we'd go get something to eat, and then we'd go to the park and they'd let me run around and we'd look at crawdads and there's water features and there's just greenery all around on one side, and then on the other side it just feels like really city. So it's a little bit of a break from like everything or your day just to unwind. So it was a
Awesome.
good.
Thanks for sharing. Let's go to Abdul, and then we'll go to Rebecca.
Yeah, hello. My favorite neighborhood park would probably be English Springs in Chino Hills, California. Part of why is me and my friends grew up there playing volleyball, and then yeah, the park also has like a nice man-made lake in the middle of it, so it's a really nice walk around the entire park.
Nice. Thanks for sharing. Rebecca, you want to jump in there?
Hi, this is Rebecca. I was gonna say that one of my favorite parks is Bixby Park in Long Beach. I used to live a few blocks from it, and when my daughter was young, and we lived in an apartment, and it was nice to kind of go there and get outside and run around and fly kites, and it's a nice park.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Rebecca. I am familiar with Bixby Park. It's a really nice area. Let's go to Jamie, and then we'll close out with Sergio today.
When I was younger, I would always go to this park in like somewhere called Rosetta Canyon Park. And that park has a lot of open space, so I would go like frisbee with my brother.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Jamie. Sergio, you want to bring us home?
Yeah, so a park that's my favorite park, it's called Sabre Park. Yeah, it's just like half a block walking distance from where I used to live. Um, I think I just remember taking my dogs and them just running like in the open field. I think that's what I remember the most.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Parks are very important to our memories and the experiences that we get to have in our community. And a lot of parks are oftentimes, you know, the little green space that some of our communities have access to. And park equity is really important. It's a big part of, you know, why, you know, landscape architecture is important. And really ensuring that there are green space that is accessible in the public realm for everyone. But we know that there are parts of our community that don't have that experience equitably. And it was really interesting to hear all of the ways that you all experience parks in your communities growing up. I'm really excited about our guest speaker today. Okay, I'm May put something in the chat. I'll go ahead and read that, and Chase Wichovich as well. Before we move on, let's go ahead and read those. I would say my favorite park would be my childhood park, the skate park. When I would go home from school, I'd skate to the park where I meet with friends, classmates, and older kids until the late night, thanks to the park's lights. Yep, park lighting is really important. And then May put in the chat, I didn't get called on, but my favorite park is Aztec Park, right next to my apartment back in San Diego. I would go there to have picnics with my friends and family, and there were always events going on like birthday parties and soccer practices. Yes, yes. People watching is always cool to do at parks too sometimes. Seeing the different schedules and the different flows of events that happen throughout the day. Yeah, but back to our guest speaker, David Salazar is a great colleague, mentor, and friend of mine. David Salazar is the executive director of the Long Beach Community Design Center and a native of Los Angeles. He has over 29 years of experience in city and facilities planning. David has held key leaderships in both public and private universities and community colleges. He holds degrees in sociology, urban and regional planning, and an executive MBA, and has studied strategic management at the Oxford and Anhuac universities. David has served in various senior positions within California State University system, which we're proud to be a part of here at Cal Poly Pomona, in the Los Angeles Community College District. He is a member of the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Certified Planners and resides in Long Beach, where he is active in the community leadership. A big part of his work is represented through what we'll be talking about today. So with that, without further ado, David, do you want to introduce yourself before we get the video started, or do you want to do it after the video?
Hey David, I think you're on mute.
All right, I'll start all over. So I did go to Long Beach State and got my undergrad in sociology. And then after that, I went directly into Cal Poly's urban planning program and their master's program. And after graduation, that's kind of what I learned there at Cal Poly and learned about planning kind of launched my career. I didn't take a traditional career in terms of urban planning. I did, when I first graduated, I worked for the city of Whittier for a couple of years, about 4 years. But then I really made my whole career in campus planning and facilities management, working at various universities, not only planning, doing the master planning, but also building buildings. And that's something that I didn't really learn at Cal Poly because it was focused on urban planning and not campus planning, master planning at that level. The thing that I did, and I'll end with this and then we'll watch the video. The thing that I did learn in a big way while I was doing campus planning and putting together multiple master plans and capital programs and all that was the power of landscape, right? And especially on a university campus. So I grew to appreciate that and worked with a lot of landscape architects over the years and put together landscape master plans for a lot of the campuses I worked on. And those were the things that probably were the most distinctive pieces on a campus and the most distinctive sort of accomplishments that I was more interested in doing at the various campuses. It wasn't all just about the buildings. It was about the areas surrounding those buildings and how landscape really is a connector, right? It's the connective tissue between buildings and spaces, and how people interact in those spaces are probably the most satisfaction that I got doing campus planning. So anyway, what you're going to see today, I'm doing something totally different, right? So Ronnell's a board member for the Long Beach Community Design Center, and that's a nonprofit here in Long Beach. We've been in existence for about 4 years. We're actually, our anniversary date is going to be coming up in October 5th. It'll be 4 years. And we provide 2 services. One is pro bono architecture and urban planning services to underserved communities. And the project that you're going to see is one of those types of projects. and the other one is really geared towards youth engagement. What we do is we engage youth to get them active and interested and exposed to urban planning and design with the idea that they would pursue a career, an academic career and a professional career. So those are the two big projects that we work on in the two areas that we work on. So this project that you're going to see is an alley restoration project, and we worked with actually two community groups. This is just one of the groups, and this is located on the corner of more or less 10th and Alamitos in Long Beach, about the central, it's kind of the central part of the city. The other project that we worked on was in the northern part of the city, off, what is it? Not Avalon, but it was on the backside of Jordan Star Elementary School. And so that you're not going to see that today, but we use the same kind of methodology in terms of how we engage the community and the tools that we use to make that happen. So I'll let you take a look at this, and then afterwards we can talk a little bit more about sort of the way I approach community engagement and my philosophy.
I first started volunteering with the Long Beach Community Design Center back in October, and then that's when we started having conversations about projects in the city, and I proposed the Restorative Alley Pathway Project here in Central Long Beach because there is a need in our alley for the city and the community to get involved and invest in it.
Well, the current state of the alley right now, you know, I stay out of it because, you know, the trash, and I really don't need any purpose to go down it. But with this Dime Alley project, with this Dime Alley alleyway, I could feel that it's going to produce a lot of skill trade and income for the community overall, but especially for youth artists and entrepreneurs.
So today's project is the second version of what we're trying to accomplish in the city by restoring alleyways behind residential buildings, behind neighborhood buildings. And the namesake of this project is called Dime Alley, and the reason that we're calling it Dime Alley, or why they called it Dime Alley, is because it's basically on the corner of 10th Street and Alamitos.
Today we're doing an exercise that's really to get some community involvement and get some feedback from the community about what thoughts or aspirations, any type of ideas of what can happen in this alley, right? A lot of it will have to do with things like memories, right? So what did people do in the past? How do they remember if they grew up in this area? What kind of memory they have of alleyways, how they've used these spaces. So this exercise is really intended to get as much feedback as possible from the people who live here, who are going to use this space, to make sure that any type of design ideas that happen later are really informed by that, and they don't just come out of nowhere.
I feel like it's a great project to teach the local community about group economics, how we could come together and start developing the space around us on our own without, you know, outside forces coming in and without us having any say-so. So I feel like, you know, this is one of those cornerstone things where it could basically spark a new wave of culture, a new wave of ownership, group economics, and togetherness.
A lot of times redevelopment is very much a top-down approach. This approach is different, right? It starts from the opposite direction, right? So it really tries to involve the community to understand what would the community want. And that's really going to inform what the final result is, right? So whereas in a typical development, you would start with a developer having an idea and telling you, this is kind of what I want to accomplish. How would you make that happen? Here, it's a bit more of a blue sky.
We're going to be visioning with the community today, asking them what they'd like to see in the alley. And we're really bringing that visioning process literally to the neighborhood in the front yard of one of the residents that'll be benefiting from those improvements. And I suspect that they're going to be looking at a whole series of different things: open space use, communal use, socialization, recreation, that kind of thing. So we'll see what they have to say today, and then we're going to translate that information into conceptual plans.
This is the community's project. That's the difference, is we're involving them from the beginning till the end. This is not my project. This is not the city's project. It's not the Long Beach Community Design Center's project. It's the community's project. So that's why it's very, very important that they're involved through the whole process, because based on what they want to see here or their needs, that's what is gonna manifest, right, at the end. So the difference is that without their support, without their input, there's no project.
So that gives you a pretty good idea sort of what our approach is and my philosophy in terms of engaging the community on projects like this. The woman that you saw there, Alejandra, she's actually a Cal Poly grad. So she graduated with her undergrad degree in urban planning. She grew up in Long Beach. She's familiar with that area. She actually lived in an apartment with her sister and her mom and her kid there on the backside, and that was their front yard of the front of the alley, right? So there's a lot of great people that come out of Cal Poly Pomona, and I'm a firm believer, not just because I went to school there, but I know the caliber of student that goes there and the education that you receive. So she's a great example of a community member, a grassroots community member that came out of the school and now wants to get involved in a big way in a lot of projects that happen in Long Beach. So, Ronnell, do you want for me to talk about sort of the engagement kind of theory? It's not really a theory, it's more of an approach related to that project.
Yeah, that'll be great. Talk about some of the ways that you collaborated with different stakeholders and what your key role was in managing the outcomes of the project.
Yeah, so you saw HED, they're an architectural firm out of Los Angeles, and they actually provided all the conceptual plans, drew up the conceptual plans, were involved in those community meetings on a pro bono basis. And typically for a project like that, it would normally cost around $30,000 or something of that sort. They brought in staff in addition to that one person that was on the video. So that's something that the community, first off, just from a financial standpoint, they can't afford that, right? And no one really from those neighborhoods can afford anything close to that. That's part of why we provide it. We act as a facilitator. But the important thing in terms of the community engagement for me and the design center is really, first of all, finding liaisons in the community. And Alejandra was a liaison, right? So finding those liaisons that actually know the community, know the families, know the individuals that live in the neighborhood, and that person acts as sort of like a conduit into this project. Because just like any underserved community or communities that have been under-resourced, their experience in working with government or nonprofit agencies or just people in general has not been a positive experience. So you need someone, a champion that you can work with, and it builds trust and understanding in the community that we're here to assist you in visualizing and conceptualizing sort of what kind of project you want. So that would be number one for me. Number two would be that the community is going to tell you what they want and what their needs are, right? So, you're going to go on and be educated and have your degree and all that other stuff, but it really doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of these types of projects, in terms of how you bring those expertise to the table, because it's really, you put the icing on the cake, but they're going to be the ones that are going to say, hey, we need this, we need lighting, we need to resurface this, we want it to be this, we want trash cans. They'll tell you exactly what that is, and you don't need to play that role. You just play the role of, okay, once we figure out what you need, this is what it could look like. What do you think? And it's an iterative process. But the most important thing is to listen to the community. And believe me, they know exactly what's needed. They know the story, right? They know the story better than you do, no matter, right? And then the other part is, this is the empowerment part, right? So we put together the conceptual plans for this project, but the second piece of this was figuring out, okay, how much is it going to cost, right? And then how that money, where that money was going to come from, who we had to work with in the city, et cetera, et cetera. So the empowerment piece comes where it's not only just visualizing whatever that project is, but working with the community group and say, okay, these are the next steps, and building leadership within those communities and those groups, right? So they can sort of learn from the process and then take it from there, right? So that's the part that's really important to me, because there's also work on their part that they need to accomplish, right? So it's not just doing something for someone and then saying, okay, we're going to figure it out for you, we're going to talk to this politician or whatever and get things done. It's not like we couldn't do that, but part of it is putting some responsibility back on the community in a good way so they can sort of take the next steps and move forward. I'll close with the technique, the actual like design technique that we used. If you notice that they were like doing a little model building or playing with, it's kind of a playful method. It's called Place It. And you could look on it, you can look at it online. There's a colleague of mine, his name's James Rojas. And I've been working with him for many years, probably 10 plus years, 15 years. And what we do is when they were sitting down at those tables, you guys kind of talked about it a little bit in terms of the park, is that we use sort of memory, childhood memory, to bring out the idea in terms of what they would like to see in that space. And that same philosophy and that same technique can be used in sort of multiple ways, right? So basically what we do is we have groups of like 5 individuals, about 5 around a table. And then we ask each person to say, recreate your childhood memory, your favorite childhood memory. So believe it or not, I mean, I've been doing this for like this technique for, I might have done it like 10 times already or more, right? What always comes out almost inevitably is like people's fondest memories is not like sitting around watching TV or playing a video game or being inside or whatever. It's all about the outdoors. It's all about like spaces, in the backyard, the front yard, at parks and whatever. I mean, it just happens over and over again. And then related to that is the idea about sort of social cohesion, right? So it's not only being in the open spaces or in parks and all that, but the activities that happened around that. And you guys kind of talked about it a little bit. It was soccer, it was hanging out with family and all that other stuff. So it's to me, the more I've been doing this, it tells me that being with other people is critical, right? And building community and family and the love that happens around that and the socialization and the talk and all that other stuff is what human beings need. And that activity, for the most part, people gravitate or talk about their memories being outside when that happens outside. So I've seen it over and over again. And like this weekend, I was at the American Planning Association conference. We did an event similar to this at the Cheech Museum, the art museum there that just opened up about 2 years ago. And we had the students basically go through the gallery, identified their best or their most favorite picture, of all the different pictures there. And then we had them come back into the room and then use this technique and say, can you recreate, what you felt or what that meant to you in terms of that piece of art? And I would say like there was probably about 20 students in there. And I would say like 2/3 of them, it was all about open space. It was all about being outdoors and all that. So it just repeats itself and it's a good thing. Yeah. And that's a good memory to have about those types of spaces. So I'll stop there and then maybe you can open it up to some questions and that kind of thing.
Yes, yes. Again, thank you so much for being present with us today, David. Really appreciate it. Definitely, students, definitely want you to ask any questions that are coming up for you. I know we've been learning about collective impact in the different ways that's facilitated as a best practice to doing our participatory budget engagement, right? So, participatory design engagement. So definitely want you all to ask the questions that are coming up for you. Anything that's coming up based off of the different case studies we've been discussing so far, even social determinants of health, collective impact framework, whatever coming up for y'all. Feel free to write in the chat or raise your hand or come off mute. So I do have a question while students are, figuring theirs out. In relation to working with impacted communities, in building trust, right? That's already a challenging kind of component. How do you manage constraints, right? Like different constraints that come up with like achieving their vision or their outcome in a design project. And when I think of constraints, I'm thinking, let's say, maybe social constraints, based off of how people have been impacted historically, and maybe how feelings are expressed in relation to that. So that could be a social constraint, or even like just being transparent with like a policy constraint or economic constraint.
Mhm. Yeah, so every community is different. Even in here in Long Beach, there's about 3 or 4 primary like ethnic communities. There's the Cambodian community, African American community, Latino community, and Filipino community. Those are the 4 major ones. And they're all different, right? And even there's subsets within those groups that are different, right? Some things are shared, there's a working class kind of component to it. There's a professional class component to it. I mean, there's all these different things. So when you're working in communities, it's really super important to understand who's in that community, who are the leaders of that community, what's that community all about, what's their history, right? That kind of thing. So that's you can't just parachute in the community and come up with all these ideas, right? So you have to understand that part. And I think some of the constraints is, well, that'd be one constraint, right? To figure out sort of those issues so it doesn't affect your work down the road. But the other part of it is figuring out the best way to kind of tailor that design related to sort of the impact you're going to receive. Because design is just the first piece of it, especially conceptual design. The other part of it, the difficult part, the more time it takes, right, is the implementation, right? And the implementation component. And there's different stages along that, finding the money, doing the working drawings, doing the construction and all that. So there's all that happening in there. And then the other part is related to the community, figuring out how astute is that community and sort of understanding these concepts, and what do they do with them, right? And helping them, kind of shepherding the process, right? Because most of the communities that I've worked in here in Long Beach, especially the underserved communities, they don't have a history of professional design at the level that you guys are learning or that I've learned, right? So they don't know the ABCs of how to get a project done. They don't know what it takes to sort of move a project through City Hall, all that. So they're relying on your expertise and your knowledge to make that happen. So those are some of the constraints that you would encounter.
Thank you so much, David, for that response. I do see a few questions in the chat. Melissa has a question. Does the company go back after the site is complete to check on how it's going and the upkeep, etc.?
Yeah, so the unfortunate part of these 2 projects that I worked on is that they're still seeking dollars to implement it, right? Implement the 2 projects. So that physically nothing has occurred yet. And that's another thing to keep in mind is that sometimes these ideas are fluid, right? So you put together the conceptual plans, you know how much it's going to cost, put together a little package and say, okay, community, it's time for you to roll, right? It's time for you to go. And sometimes it doesn't happen as quickly as it probably should. And because I'm all about getting things done, right, in my job and in my career, but I sort of had to taper that back. I had to like pull back a little bit because otherwise I'd be doing it all for them, right? And that's not the purpose behind it. The purpose behind it is to empower those communities so they understand the next steps, provide some guidance and kind of shepherd the process, but they got to do that other work and all that. So that's a roundabout way of saying that they're still in the process of sort of identifying the funding sources and all that to move forward. I still have confidence that it's going to get done, but it's going to just take a little bit longer than I thought. So when they get to that point, they're going to have to hire an architect, a landscape architect or an architect to actually start putting together the next phase of the design because it was only conceptual design. I think that answers that one question.
Thank you for your response to that, David. Patty has a question. What's the most challenging outreach you encountered and how did you guys tackle it?
Actually, it's gone really smooth in terms of the outreach. There's always language barriers sometimes, whether it be Spanish or Tagalog or the native languages that they speak, the different communities. But there's always ways to get around that. But there hasn't been really challenges on the outreach with those communities. I think more of the challenges have been through the kind of the bureaucratic process with the city and having the city understand that this is an important project for the community and you have to work together and all that. But that's another sort of story in and of itself. But as far as working in the community, I haven't really encountered any major challenges in terms of the outreach. I think the key there is, again, finding a liaison and a leader, a trusted leader in those communities, and they'll be the ones that'll be opening up the doors for you.
Awesome. I think this next question is a perfect follow-up to that. How do you balance what the community wants with what the city allows with zoning permits?
Right. So zoning and land use is always a bugaboo, right? You can't just do anything you want no matter what. So one interesting sort of component to these two alley projects is that Public Works, not the planning department, actually maintains roads and alleys and sidewalks and public right-of-ways, that kind of thing, right? Lighting, all these things. So they're not the most progressive group in the world, right? Typically people in Public Works are usually engineer types, right? So they don't think like a designer necessarily or a planner or anything like that. So part of it was them understanding, yeah, we want to repurpose these alleys for another use, right? We're not saying we're going to close the alleys down. We're going to say they want to use this as an asset because in those same communities, they don't have access to parks and open space on that side of town as they do on the east side of town, right? So that was probably one of the things that that the hurdle that still has to get navigated. It wasn't necessarily the zoning because it's already an alley, right? We weren't going to say we're going to turn it into multifamily housing or mixed use development or anything. We're going to maintain it as an alley, except we're going to be using it not only for cars, but for people and some other things. So that was a little paradigm kind of shift for the Public Works folks to understand.
Awesome. I really appreciate that framing, David, because sometimes, these efforts may be policy, there may be a policy shift that's required in order to move forward, or a zoning change that needs to happen, or a barrier in that regard. But sometimes it's a conversation and understanding, where there's alignment to language or use case that's already in existence, right? Using the existing policy as a window to achieving the desired outcome.
Right. Yeah, it's all about parks and open space in those parts of the city. And this is just one alternative, solution to that, right? Is it the ideal solution? Well, no, probably not, but it's one solution to sort of deal with that park equity issue.
All right, so we have Carla's question in the chat. Knowing that these projects takes a long time because of funding or permitting, how do you keep the stakeholders engaged while waiting to move on to the next steps?
Yeah, so that gets back to the leadership part of it, right? And I really truly believe this. Sometimes, it's hard for me because I'm sort of motivated to get things done all the time, and I have my own time frame in my head about when things should get done and when they shouldn't, how long it takes. But I've sort of tried not to impose my will on the community, right? So it's almost like here it is, you told us what it is, here's a conceptual plan, this is what it's costing and all that. Now, I can help you as much as you want me to help you, but you got to do that work, right? It's almost like, and I'll say this across the board, it's like, they have to have skin in the game in order to make it work, right? So there's a level of responsibility on that side. And the folks that we were working with from the leadership standpoint, they were really the ones that really are responsible to keep those communities engaged and say, okay, this is what we're doing and all this other stuff. There's a human dynamic part of that. But I didn't really want to get into the thing where like, okay, all right, tell me what's happening. It's been too long. You guys have to get off, your butt and start doing stuff and all that. I didn't want to be the taskmaster because they have to take that responsibility on and do it, right? Yeah. So I guess the way to answer that question would be that it's really up to the community to make sure that things get done.
Awesome. Any other questions coming to mind for folks? It's a great opportunity, to speak to a practitioner. I know you all have some big assignments coming up, so ask your questions now. All right. Well, really appreciate the folks that participate in the chat. Everyone, please give David a thumbs up, hands clap, celebration. Thank you so much, David, for being present with us this evening. Your insight is super incredible. We've been looking at a lot of case studies, but your work is really reflective of the types of projects we've been looking at. And you in the field as a practitioner doing projects here locally is really inspiring to see. And we really look forward to seeing the development of your projects as they continue to grow.
Yeah. Like I said, I haven't given up on these projects. They're going to happen one way or another. There's a movement in Long Beach now around the whole idea about parks and open space. So the city's taking it seriously. And I know a lot of the communities are being really empowered by it and activated by the whole idea about sort of how we sort of address this issue, and make sure that we have just as much as the people on the east side in terms of, parks and open space and access to that. So, and best of luck to you in your studies and your career. You're going to play a critical role in projects like this, and going forward and working with communities.
I did put the website link in the chat, but is there any other way that students can stay involved or engaged with you, David, in the work that Long Beach Community Design Center is doing?
Yeah, so there's a lot of cool stuff coming forward right now. I've been approached by the Trust for Public Land. They're going to be doing a park equity accelerator program in the city, and we're going to be looking exactly at this kind of work, but at the policy level, talking to the various communities about what they'd like to see in parks and open space in the city, and figuring out how to facilitate that, whether it's the creation of a new park, sort of a renovation of existing park, looking at alternative sort of more creative ways like this alleyway or Green Schools Initiative, looking at greening schools as a way to sort of address parks and open space. So they can just, if they're interested, they can, there's an information email that I have on the website, and they can send me some information, but there could be some other things that they can get involved in. The other thing that we're providing this semester is an internship program. The application's closed already on the 19th, but I know that there's about 3 or 4 landscape architect Cal Poly students that applied. And we're going to be doing the selection process and the interviews coming up in the next couple of weeks. So looking forward to that. But I'll always be plugged into Cal Poly. It meant a lot to me going to school there, and it provided me with a lot in terms of, what my career is at today, even though I retired and then kind of created this other career. But all the things that I learned and all that were pretty remarkable. So I'm a big fan and supporter of the college.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to seeing you soon. I know we have a meeting in a couple of weeks. But yes, to the students, definitely take advantage of staying in contact with the work that the Long Beach Community Design Center is doing. Like David mentioned, there'll be the most recent internship opportunity closed, but there will most likely be opportunities in the future. So definitely stay in tune, stay in touch, make sure you're networking and connecting with the folks that we connect with in this course. All right. Well, thank you, David, so much for your time. I won't keep you for the rest of the evening, but we really appreciate the time you spent with us so far.
All right, great. Well, great meeting you guys. Take care.
All right, students. I hope you all enjoy that. Before we get started with the rest of the lecture, we're going to go ahead and take a break. Feel free to, use the restroom, get a snack, grab something to drink, and we'll be back shortly. Let's say 6:58. Well, we'll take about, 6:58. See y'all back shortly. All right, we should be making our way back now. Let's see. Please show me your thumbs up if you're back with me. So I see folks got their thumbs up. How did y'all enjoy our guest speaker today? Was it informative?
It was great having someone actually doing this, like what we're learning in real life. So it was very informative. Thank you.
Awesome, awesome. I see Jorge, I see a few thumbs up. Very insightful. Jorge says very insightful in the chat. Thank you, Carla, for speaking up on that. Yeah, you know, these projects are really happening with community-centered perspectives, right? It's really good to hear from folks, from practitioners who are actually doing the work. All right, so today's lecture, love to meet ones in the industry with community engagement. Amen to that, Chase. So again, today's lecture, we're going to be talking about violence through design, the different ways that it shows up. And as landscape architects, there's site reading strategies that, you know, we can apply to understanding, you know, what that looks like contemporarily, as well as historically. So we'll definitely look at how that's done. And then we'll talk about how you can prioritize your engagement, and then also tools for that engagement. So, you know, we inherited a lot from our forefathers, the folks who, you know, originally started architecture and, you know, all the cultural practices that came with it. With that being said, first there was Europe. The American origins of architecture have a historical narrative of the European landscape. Architectures were reduced to stylistic debates about picturesque and beauty, little reflection on site uniqueness or cultural relevance to the region. This approach limited landscape architecture and did not allow it to emerge as a new profession. European history provided a lens for contemporary practice, struggled to maintain recognition as a fine art. European approach heavily influenced the 19th century architects, right? We see that in a lot of the landscapes that, you know, have built our culture and society, these big evergreen lawns. A lot of those are remnants of European landscapes and are not oftentimes native to the region, right? That's a big part of what we're dealing with here in Southern California, where there's water restrictions, and a lot of folks who are now changing their landscapes to more natural landscapes that reflect our region versus what has been traditionally practiced, these beautiful, luscious green lawns, right? Raise your hand if you recall, you know, the 90s green lawn. And if you've kind of seen this shift, right, into not using the green lawn approach as much and going more to natural landscapes. Yep, Melissa's in the chat, I see some hands. Yep, so that's really important to consider in relation to what we're trying to create interventions for. Planners, like architects, are site readers and editors, right? The site's character is revealed through design editing by amplification, subtraction, distillation, or compression. This action brings Latin quality to the phenomenal focus by transposing site memory of other culturally meaningful sites, right? So that's the role oftentimes of landscape architects. Some site reading strategies used in landscape architecture are using the site as a temporal phenomena. This refers to a unique subjective experience tied to a specific time and place. These experiences, like sunrise, sunset, or seasonal events, like springtime blooms, can only occur under certain conditions, making them time sensitive. And sometimes that can be enhanced on your site, right? Or there can be marketing to bring people to your site at certain times of the year. You could talk about, you could brand your site the best sunsets in LA, right? Those different temporal phenomena and components really come up to play in that regard. Then you have a site reading strategy leveraging the geological fragment. And that's when you have a division of land into smaller parcels, often used for conservation tools or land management strategies and design. It can also serve to protect resources, preserve ecosystems, or guide development. A lot of times this could be reflective in what I think somebody was sharing about New York, right? And so you can create a geological fragment in context of what's allowed, right? If you're designating X amount of acres for green space. And oftentimes these can be in urban settings where green space is scarce, right? And so you'll see this big shift of how the land is used, from urban settings to more rural lands, or urban forestry spaces, or even different designated sites like, county parks, city parks, state parks. All those can be examples of geological fragmenting of the land to ensure that you're preserving that usage for particular aspects. Then you have site as an ecosystem. It involves leveraging the interaction between living organisms and their physical environment. This approach emphasizes creating habitats with essential components like water, food, shelter, and space for raising young to support wildlife within a landscape. You can have site as a geomorphological figure, where the site focuses on the landforms and their natural evolution. This perspective centers around understanding the shape, structure, and development of land as it changes over time, and really letting it do its thing, right? When I think of this, I oftentimes think of Central Park and the rocks that have formed in Central Park, right? There's really nothing you can do about those rocks. So you kind of have to build around that, or that can take center stage. But again, that rock formation has, been formed over millennia. But it's there in the park. It's a central component of the park. And it can't be removed from how this park is designed or developed, right? So then you may want to highlight those geomorphological figures within your site to enhance their relevance to your design. And then site as an armature is really looking at your site when it's used as a skeleton to support the design and development of your landscape. It may guide features and elements, how they're modeled, or the range that they can take. Say if your site is within a prairie, and so you can use the prairie to make a park, kids section of the park, right? And it's framed within the borders of the urban forestry and the trees that line the prairie. And so it becomes like a framework and a skeleton for you to fill with whatever landscape design ideas that you have. So site as a framework, or an armature. So really thinking of those site strategies and approaches is really critical when you come across the site, because you can really start to think of, how will your site be used? How do you manage, let's say, environmental constraints like a geomorphological figure? How do you manage that, right? There may be barriers to what can be built on the site because of those components. So really understanding how to read a site and leverage that insight to inform your design. With that being said, that historical traditional approach is now fueled with us being more critical, right? And figuring out, in addition to the ways that we're reading site, what are we misreading in the site, right? What are we missing? Who are we engaging in the process? So really looking at how, let's say, sight reading has evolved from the 20th century landscape architectural modifications, right, that have happened over time. I mean, what we're charging ourselves to do now as 21st century designers, in regards to making sure that the least represented historically or traditionally now have a seat at the table as collaborators and partners. So some things that you all want to be thinking about when you're thinking of historical planning practices or landscape practices are what is missing from the conversation, who is missing from the conversation, and is whom or what is missing intentional. How have you experienced the built environment? So I do want to have you all reflect on that, and I'll have either a few volunteers or folks come off mute before I start picking on folks. But you can choose any of these questions to respond to. But historically, when you're thinking of sight reading strategies and how folks have historically been impacted by this by sight, and how, let's say, picturesque components or really cultural significance components that are really European centered have influenced our design practice that we're engaging with on a day-to-day now in the 21st century. And some of it's being changed and modified. But when we're thinking of those historical and traditional practice, what would you say is missing from the conversation? Who is missing from the conversation? Would you say that is intentional or unintentional? And how would you say you've experienced the built environment? So you can answer any of those questions. Feel free to raise your hand, respond in the chat, or come off mute. Those are 3 options that you all have before I start picking on folks. All right, Claudia's the brave soul that dares to write in the chat. Thank you so much, Claudia, for your participation. The community is missing from the conversation. All people, not only people who have major influence or on funds spent in the landscape design. Yes, thank you so much for naming that, Claudia. Yeah, you talk about all people, right? Not only people who have major influence or funds. And historically and traditionally, people who are wealthy, people who are quote unquote educated, people who are, male have been able to have a seat at the table. People who are white, right, have been able to have a seat at the table historically and traditionally. I mean, that's shifting in a lot of ways now, right? But historically and traditionally, that was the case. And so our built environment reflects that. See some more responses in the chat. Maya, I think something often missing from the conversation is how the site is currently being used. On paper, something may be undeveloped a lot, or underdeveloped a lot, but actually it may be being used by the community for other purposes. It is important to consider these things before signing off on the development. Yes, indeed, right? You may be cutting off a resource without knowing it, right? If you're not understanding how the site is used. And sometimes sites aren't used as they're intended, right? Folks make use of sites as they're convenient. Uses and convenience of site may change over time. So that is a very, really big takeaway, Maya. Thank you for sharing that. Understanding how the site is currently being used in the community is super critical before making any changes to a site for sure. Anything else coming up for folks? Again, feel free to raise your hand,
Professor,
respond in the chat, or come off mute.
can you hear me?
Manuel?
Yeah.
Feel free to jump in there.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Oh,
Feel free to jump in there, Manuel. Yeah, it was very low for me as well. But I will read what Chase responded in the chat, and feel free to either type it in the chat or come off of mute right after I'm done reading. Okay, so Chase says marginalized groups, including people with disabilities, low-income communities, and indigenous populations are frequently left out of the planning and design process. Yes, thank you for naming that, Chase. That's super critical to understand and name and really try to address when you are bringing up these design opportunities. Williams puts in the chat, I feel that most of the time community is pushed aside because of the stakeholders' goal. An example would be removing part of the landmark to create new shops for significant profit. Some people can hear you, Manuel. Let's try again. Feel free to come off of mute, Manuel.
Can you hear me?
I hear you very low, but feel free to go ahead and
type it
go
in.
for it.
I'll type it in.
Okay, you'll type it in the chat?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else want to share? But what about intentionality? Anyone want to talk about whether or not they think it's intentional that folks are missing? Or anyone want to respond to how they've experienced the built environment? Thank you, Manuel. I see that you've responded in the chat. For the third question, I think that the Eurocentric process is design was at first not intentional. But as local communities began to form and again, more influence, it became intentional to keep those voices down. Yes, Manuel, thank you so much for sharing that. Sometimes things don't start off intentional, but then they have this disparate impact. Some people are benefiting and some people aren't. And because, you know, that benefit is there and experienced by those folks, they don't want to lose it. So it becomes a challenge to get them to see the benefit of sharing that across the board. Jasmine, I think I seen your hand. Do you want to go ahead and jump in there?
Yeah, similar to what you said and or mentioned. I feel like in a way it's intentional because obviously not everybody's going to be satisfied with the outcome. But if more people are, or like less people are heard, then I guess it's more convenient for other people because of the money.
Indeed, indeed. It can be time consuming. It can cost more, right, to invest in engagement. But at the same time, that's more upfront. You know, to your point, I think if you're thinking like short-ended, then you're like, wait, that's too much to spend on that engagement. However, if you end up investing in your project idea and the community completely rejects it, you're going to end up having to spend double the project anyway, right? So it's better to do that engagement up front, which will save money in the long run. And that's really a good perspective. Thank you for sharing that, Jasmine. I see a couple of more folks share it in the chat. Chase, it can often be intentional, rooted in systemic inequality and profit-driven motives. Yes, yes, yes. Speak on it. Let's move on. Let's look at this historic component. You know, there are systemic roots of the design problem. And so this video quickly goes over some of that. So let's quickly get into it so we can move on with the lecture.
The urban environment is a feat of human decision-making. From where to develop street grids lined with large glass office buildings, to which green spaces to preserve for outdoor recreation. How humans make these choices, and the natural environment's response, can create extremely different ecosystems in neighborhoods just a few blocks away from each other. Researchers delved into dozens of studies to understand what drives these variations. One well-documented phenomenon in cities is the relationship between wealth and biodiversity. More affluent areas generally have greater canopy cover, with larger, mature trees, as well as a higher diversity of birds. This is known as the luxury effect. Low-income areas typically have more man-made surfaces, including major heat absorbers like asphalt and concrete, compared to higher-income areas. The lack of shade from trees and vegetation, combined with more asphalt and concrete, makes it hotter in these neighborhoods, a phenomenon known as an urban heat island. These communities are also more likely to be near sources of air pollutants, like expansive interstates pumping car exhaust. Although wealth can sometimes predict the outcomes of an urban ecosystem, there isn't always a clear relationship. In some cases, the racial makeup of a neighborhood is better than income when forecasting canopy cover. Researchers explored studies that highlighted how systemic racism shaped our built environment. One glaring example in the United States is residential segregation. From 1933 to 1968, the federal government limited access to homeownership among Black Americans through a practice known as redlining. Neighborhoods were graded based on the riskiness of providing a mortgage in the area. The grades ranged from A, the most desirable areas full of wealthy businessmen, to D, neighborhoods considered high-risk investments due to a combination of factors, from their environmental quality and distance from large industrial factories, to the main determinant, the presence of foreign-born and Black people. The inability for Black people to buy homes in these neighborhoods meant many types of capital investments left. Landlords abandoned their properties, and public services such as transportation and park maintenance weren't prioritized. Today, many U.S. cities still exhibit long-lasting environmental impacts from this discrimination. Neighborhoods which had a D grade in the 60s have about half the canopy cover of historically white communities. Some studies evaluate how the current environment relates to historically redlined neighborhoods, but researchers did not find any research that traces how ecosystems changed over time because of this segregation. They propose that because habitable regions are more spread out in these areas, animal populations struggle to breed since they are cut off from each other. The reduced breeding options for animals could have decreased gene diversity, an important way for animals to adapt to changing environments. And decreased gene flow of native species could promote the abundance of pest species, like mosquitoes and brown rats, which carry diseases that can infect humans. The combination of all these outcomes, from urban heat islands to increased pests, make low-income marginalized communities far more vulnerable to risks like climate change. Scientists say such evidence shows that conservation and social justice cross paths, especially along neighborhood streets.
So that was a really quick video to really look at the historical systemic relationship the lack of green space has to the built environment, right? These were decisions made historically. They're made up of policy decisions and divestment practices that were set up to harm people of color, particularly Black folks. And, you know, what happens with bad infrastructure is that it eventually impacts us all, right? And so like the video is talking about, when we're talking about the impacts these practices have on the environment and the, you know, lack of diversity in species for native species and plants, as well as flora and fauna. It's really important to name that, right? And really work to repair that. But today it's really looking at this from the lens of intentionality, because again, like we talked about, some of these things were intentional. And so moving into the use of landscape for violence, we know that green space is something that's supposed to be helpful and beautiful and evoke, you know, a sense of pride and community, but we know that historically landscape has been used for violence. Different types of violence. Some of that violence has been intentional, like Black folks being hung from trees. This picture depicts the gathering of white folks around this tree, which normally would depict someone hanging, but it's just the tree and the community that gathered around it. And it really is centering for me the ways that community gather and how that sometimes has been around violence and who that has harmed. But most importantly, how the landscape was used to help facilitate that violence. And what that means for, everyone who experiences the landscape. It may elicit different experiences and different outcomes. And so this was really important to me to use because a lot of times we're not thinking of how the things we build around us and the landscape can be used to harm us. And this is a very visceral image. This is a very physical representation of the violence. With that being said, the violence and how it's experienced in the built environment isn't always this extreme. So just be mindful of that as well. But one of the things that we're thinking about in regards to how the environment impacts folks is you have the environment, but then you have the people who are in that environment, right? Folks who represent identities of age, sex, race, genetic profile, previous disease, immune status, religion, customs, occupation, marital status, family background, all of that can be impacted by the environment that you find yourself in. So when we're thinking about the environment, we're thinking about the temperature, humidity, altitude, crowding, housing, neighborhood, water, milk, food, radiation, pollution, noise. And a lot of folks that we experience this with, some folks have been in this environment for generations. Some folks from immigrant communities are coming to this environment for the first time, right? And have never come across some of the diseases, right, that folks have here in America. Or, there's all of these different ways that your environment impacts the experience that you have. Also the agent, right? You have agent like biological, bacteria, viruses, chemicals, poisons, alcohol, smoke, physical, trauma, radiation, fire, nutritional, lack of access. So all of these things impact the individual and how they experience the environment and also how they influence the environment, right? With that being said, we talked about the different sight reading strategies and the different ways that the violent can be, the environment, the built environment, the landscape can cause harm. Historical practices of this include some of these monuments, right? These monuments that we're very familiar with, honoring Confederate soldiers who participated in trying to maintain slavery here in America. These are very public monuments, right? This is a picture of Robert E. Lee and a few other folks from the Confederate Army. And this is on the side of the Stone Mountain in Georgia, right? And so when we think of a site, right, and we talked about, like, let's say the temporal effect of a site and the inspiration one might feel from a site, like, who is this supposed to inspire? Who is this supposed to make feel good? Right? You think about that. So again, we talked about how violence doesn't always have to be intentional, but it can be the result of the lack of infrastructure in these communities that are oftentimes communities of color. A lot of times, these consequences of mass death are not always things that happen all the time, right? These are occurrences that happen because of a heat wave or a natural disaster that no one was expecting. But then it becomes evident, right, that there's inequity in infrastructure. There's inequity in the built environment. There's inequity in the overhead canopy. There's inequity in regards to dams and levees in certain communities and neighborhoods that are along the river, right? This is a news clip of a heat wave that happened in Chicago where almost over 300 people died, right? And it was really sad. I think it was that toll again is reflective of a lot of the challenges that we're experiencing in regards to climate change, but it also reflects the lack of infrastructure and support that exists within a community where that can disproportionately impact people of color. So those design blind spots are critical to see up front, so that mass death and mass harm do not continue to happen. And this may not have been intentional, right? But it's important to see that as an area of opportunity. This is happening more and more. You know, we're dealing with I think it's Hurricane Helene on our eastern seaboard right now, and there's devastating impacts that many of these communities just do not have the infrastructure to withstand. And so there's a lot of opportunity to ensure that that's addressed. But really, when we're talking about prioritizing, a lot of communities of color are the ones that are going to be the most impacted when the levees break or when there's a heat wave. And so when we're prioritizing investments on addressing those issues, building initiatives around increasing overhead canopy or prioritizing repairs, really looking at strategic ways to ensure that impacted communities are prioritized is super, super critical. Any questions coming up for folks as we're walking through this so far? So what does this look like here in our region? Environmental racism looks like environmental impacts of extractive economic practices. Many of us may live here in the LA region. Some of us live along the 710 corridor, which is right next to the LA River. And that corridor is really connected to the economic heart of the United States of America. You have the Los Angeles port and the Long Beach port that provides a lot of goods, right? A lot of imports from all around the world that make their way here to America. And then the infrastructure of the train, as well as the trucks, right, that come up and down the 710, feed America through the ports. And a lot of those practices are important because it ensures that our economy is strong. It ensures that folks get what they purchase from Amazon in a timely manner, right? But there's an impact on the environment that it has. There's an impact on community that it has in regards to where that infrastructure is built, which communities dealt with a lot of those eminent domain practices, right? Federal funding for community for the federal freeways. A lot of those projects were initiated using eminent domain laws, which allowed government to displace whole communities for projects. So when we're talking about the 110 freeway, the 105, the 710, many of these freeways were built in a position that impacted Black communities. That's important to name and to know, because many folks have been impacted economically for generations as a result of that. And today, there's a disproportionate impact on pollution, air quality, groundwater quality, all these different components that play out in direct connection to the impacts that folks have every day. Communities like Wilmington, for example, who have infrastructure of oil refineries sometimes right up against residents' backyards. Many community families in these communities are dealing with respiratory illnesses, have asthma, right? And this isn't something that they've always had. Many times they move into these communities without these respiratory illnesses. And as a result of moving into these communities, they start to develop these symptoms. And then there's the issue of land use, right? Empty lots. We talked about parks and the important role that parks play. We even talked about the different shortcuts that we take through alleyways and different empty lots. Many case studies that we reviewed this semester show how communities are very resourceful and sometimes use spaces as they're not intended, but very much so effectively and use and really create a good use for those spaces. But again, this is what environmental racism looks like. I know when we're talking about land, toxic land and water runoff, a lot of the natural aquifers and water wells in this region are poisoned because of toxic runoff as a result of a lot of these factories, right, that are up against that 710 corridor, and which historically, right up against Black and brown communities, were not regulated effectively. Even to this day, there's different companies, I think it's Toxide, I can't even think of the name. But it was a company right there in the city of Commerce that recently shut down, went bankrupt, but there was a pushback on the community because they wanted them to remediate a lot of the toxic waste that they were leaving. And it was just ridiculous how they weren't held accountable as much as they should have been. And that, again, those practices lead right into the quality of the water that we have right beneath our feet. And a lot of folks don't really pay attention to that because maybe, you know, our drinking water comes from different sources, but that doesn't matter if that groundwater is under the football field that you play Pop Warner or high school football on, right? So there's still impact on that. It doesn't matter if that's the plot of land that you plan to grow fresh produce on, but you can't grow any right out of the ground because of the toxic groundwater that's there, right? So these really have big consequences. The LA River, you know, they're talking about the restoration of it, but just imagine 100 years ago when it was a river, and there was salmon coming up the LA River from Long Beach, right? Like, imagine that. But they had to tame the river, right? But tame it to do what, right? There's so many opportunities for the river, but right now it's oftentimes used as a dumping ground. But it is really, I guess, hopeful when you see organizations like Friends of the LA River working on the LA revitalization plan, the LA River revitalization master plan and revitalization plan. But again, these experiences that we're having with the built environment right here in our region reflect some of these challenges with environmental racism that we're reflecting on today. So we talked about those temporal effects of statues and monuments dedicated to Confederate soldiers, evoking different feelings for those who encounter them. For Black Americans and other people of color, these images represent a violent relationship to this country and the celebration and its advocacy for violence to continue in any way possible, political, economic, social, and equity. All these outcomes are informed by policy and urban planning and design decisions, which can result in violence and disparate impact. So we really want to be mindful of those traditional practices and really ensure that, you know, when we're taking up space in these rooms and we're, you know, hearing design practices, we're not allowing these practices to go unchecked, right? We can call them out. We can name the historical harm that they've caused in the past and make recommendations for an alternative approach that is more community-centered and environmentally and considerate of the environment as well. What's really happening though now is that there's a lot of health disparities because of these lack of the traditional practice of inequity, right, and planning, as well as in the environment. There's a lack of green space, lack of parks, overhead canopies. One of the things that really stood out from when we were sharing about our parks is that many folks were driving very far away to access safe parks or parks that they can go to with their families, right? Many folks did talk about the neighborhood parks, but there was a significant amount of folks who had to share about a park that was very far away. And that could be for many reasons, right? But that's an important component in making sure that there is park and equitable green space, and folks don't have to drive far to access those experiences. Also, communicable diseases or high rates of diabetes, heart disease, and other illnesses are very rampant in underserved communities. Communicable diseases, we experienced that with COVID. There were very large swaths of Black and Brown communities that experienced COVID death and COVID positive a lot more than other areas of the city. And oftentimes that was because of where folks worked or because of the amount of folks that, you know, lived in the house or community. So the contraction rates were a lot higher. The lack of access to quality care, location of facilities. We talk about the environmental impact that environmental racism has. And it's really unfortunate that even though many communities of color are harmed because of infrastructure or decisions they have no part in, they're also experiencing the harm and not getting any resolve from that, right? No discounts on health, no, oftentimes they're not getting the environmental impact report on the status of their community and how it's affected by, let's say, refineries that may be near them. And so a lot of these things create lack of quality of life and health, and no one's being held accountable for it. And those environmental factors like toxic groundwater, air pollution, and food deserts all impact behavior sometimes, right? And so we think about the criminal justice system and the impact that it's having on communities as well, and over policing. And those same communities are oftentimes impacted by toxic air or toxic groundwater that oftentimes result in behavior issues, right? Mental health challenges because of that exposure. And then there's that added sense of over policing on top of that. So it's really important to understand that a lot of the interventions for these are in landscape, right? When we're talking about remediation of land, the types of trees that are planted, addressing the lack of overhead canopy, many of these things are about the landscape. If we're talking about creating active lifestyles, creating more parks, or creating different trails, right? That encourage active lifestyle, active transportation. All of those things can be influenced by landscape designers. So all of these things can be heavy, right? And overwhelming to think about, but understanding your role as a landscape designer is super critical. I know this is a lot of information and it's like, well, what do you do? How do you prioritize? How do you figure out where to start, right? Well, it just really depends on your set of research. There may be a priority that you're focusing on. You may be looking at particular types of landscapes. Maybe it's residential landscapes that you're focusing on. Maybe it's public landscapes. Maybe it's parks. Maybe it's natural landscapes, right? And so really identifying what your focus area is. Maybe you're focusing on looking at it from a perspective of impacted communities. So you're looking at where are the communities that have the worst air quality in the region. So when you're prioritizing your engagement, you definitely want to look at the data, the quantitative data, and really figure out, do you need to map any of your data so that you can paint the picture of why you're prioritizing your areas in any way? There's a lot of platforms that can map things for you. For example, this is a tool for the Cal Enviro screen. If you're looking at particular communities for air quality and you want to identify communities that have the worst air quality, or maybe you want to see what yours ranks as your address, you could type your address in there and it'll tell you how your address and the air quality has in the spectrum of worst to least impacted. It also has some other components in regards to how the different characteristics of your address or whatever address you put in has, for example, the quality of the drinking water, the impact of traffic, hazardous waste, impaired water, solid waste, asthma, low birth weight, right? So all of these different components. And so when you're thinking about prioritizing your projects, oftentimes looking at the issue area and then figuring out how you want to map that issue and figure out which areas in your region are most impacted by the issue is a really great practice, so that again, you're prioritizing the most impacted communities. But once you identify the most impacted communities, you want to engage the people there, right? So before we get into community engagement techniques, we're going to watch another quick video that really reflects on violence in the landscape, how it's remembered, and how it's how stories are told around it.
One step beyond.
Estimates are that by 2050, 66% of the world's population will live in cities. This means that one day cities will be home to almost all of us. Cities often exist for centuries. Languages and nations are often shorter-lived. Generations pass through, foreign peoples, new rulers, a multitude of languages. The city survives it all. But is this true? Can cities survive it all? My name is Arna Mačkić and I'm an architect. Architecture can be a powerful tool. It can offer its users the possibility to be confronted with other people and to create shared memories. It can offer the opportunity for people to identify with these spaces because they can connect their memories and stories to a physical space. But what does it mean if you cannot recognize yourself in what you see around you? If the stories on display cannot be accessed by you, are forgotten or excluded because, for example, you cannot afford it or you lack the so-called appropriate cultural background, then you're not at home, a stranger in the city you live in. You're not able to contribute, not involved, not responsible. From a very young age, I got to know what nationalism, exclusion, war, and being a refugee was. And as a result of that, I also had the opportunity to start a new life here in the Netherlands with my family and to position myself in a new environment. In those years, I lived in a so-called mixed but actually segregated neighborhood, and this influenced the way I view architecture a lot. In those years and in that neighborhood, I had gradually become Dutch, but also a little bit Surinamese, Turkish, Antillean, and all the other cultures and identities which I met in the massive apartment building we were living in. And this is actually one of the most valuable experiences that I had. And the reason why I became an architect is because I realized that architecture can facilitate this. But it can also discourage it by excluding certain groups of people in using these spaces. And only if we recognize the multiple realities of identities and identifications can a city be formed that facilitates inclusivity. And I will give you an example of what is at stake if this inclusivity is not our ambition. After the war ended, I visited my family city, Mostar in Bosnia-Herzegovina, almost every summer. About 70% of the city did not survive the war. And even when the violence was over, returning home was no option because everything that was familiar was gone, because an important war strategy to destroy a people is to destroy everything they know. And this is what happened to my family, but is also daily reality right now for a lot of families. For example, families from Syria or Eritrea that have fled to the Netherlands these last few years and are maybe your new neighbors right now. People identify themselves with public buildings and public spaces, landmarks of their lives in the city, connecting them to their personal story, their history. Bridges, museums, libraries, and squares. These are all chapters and verses of lives, connected to the people that are using them. What if we could create cities in which all its citizens could recognize themselves? Cities in which everyone gets to write a verse. Architecture was used as a tool in the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. By deliberately destroying public buildings and spaces, a history and a culture of a city vanished. The most profound act of destruction was that of the old bridge in Mostar. The bridge was a symbol for the city. The city was named after the bridge. It stood for the connection between the two halves of the city, for tolerance and unity. It was an important location for meeting people, the location of the celebrated yearly diving competition, and the best place for first dates. For generations of people, the city was the bridge and the bridge was the city. By destroying the bridge, the soul of the city was extinguished. The city became mortal, the city died. Destruction is not the only way to remove the soul from a city. Changing the rules, changing the access can have the same devastating effect. And when I visited Mostar after the war, I saw how a lot of public places were transformed into nationalist hotspots, where certain rules and politics applied, and where specific groups of people were excluded. Witnessing this, I realized cities are not only built from bricks, concrete, or stone, but rather by memories, millions of memories, inherently linked to a certain place, and a place you need access to in order to access those memories or to create them. And people in Mostar that were excluded from those hotspots were unable to access a part of their history, and by that, their history was denied. And linking this phenomenon to, for example, this country, where Dutch colonial past, and especially its victims, is denied in public space, can have the same devastating effect for some of our citizens. And people that know me really well, they know that talking about this combination of war and architecture, it's not my favorite thing to do, because I've been doing it a lot these last few years, because I think it's important to learn from mistakes that are made in history. And as you notice, this story is not about the Bosnia of 1993. It's about you and me and the cities we live in today. And is it possible to create cities in which centuries of memories are preserved, but new ones are collected as well? Kaleidoscopic spaces. With each turn, you see a different story, and the multitude of them is the beauty. As guilty as the act of destruction and exclusion are, the act of building a city can be just as exclusive and destructive. In so many cities today, the public spaces that are built tell the stories of the few. Other people can walk the streets, sometimes even enter a building, but they will never be part of the story. If we are to build inclusive cities, this needs to change. But who decides which stories are told by the buildings around us? Who decides which part of history is on display? By choosing this, we choose what is important, we choose who is important. The cities that we create right now, these pricey, picture-perfect cities, makes us lose touch. They're short-lived, not shared, and not remembered. And don't get me wrong, I'm not against pricey places like the ones you saw in these last images. But if it cannot exist next to places that are less pricey or offer other possibilities of use or maybe other products, then we will create homogeneous cities. Cities that are filled with places like these, where we can drink coffee and eat banana bread till we drop dead. Yeah, like as if we as citizens don't like any other products. And we have to ask ourselves the question, who decides about this and why? We need to cultivate the fact that human encounters between different people are important, because it's the connection between you and someone else, someone different than you, that makes us who you are. If we lose sight of the other, if the other is not part of our daily reality anymore, whoever that other is, we will lose something very valuable. The ability to constantly redefine ourselves in relation to others. And this is exactly what went wrong in Mostar, because people lost sight of each other. The old bridge is rebuilt, but it's lost its meaning, because it's just a symbol of a fake connection. Muslims and Catholics live separated from each other, each on one side of the bridge with their own hospitals, schools, football clubs, etc. Can we see a city as a book that is constantly being written without losing any old chapters? Even the wounds of the past, the interpretations of the present, and with space for new thoughts that even haven't been taught yet. We have to find shared points of reference in public space to bind different people to one place. That is what I try to do. In Mostar, I made a design proposal in which I included a ritual as old as time. Diving off of the old bridge is a custom where young men are learned how to dive and ultimately test their manhood by diving into the river. Every year, a diving contest is held where highboard divers from different religious backgrounds take the plunge. And in this urban activity, it doesn't matter who you are or where you're from, it connects people through the courage to do so. I use this to design a monument which is dedicated to the ritual of diving, where citizens can learn step by step how to dive from great heights, and with the plunge from the new old bridge as the final step. The 3-second jump towards the water provides a feeling of weightlessness and freedom, where one becomes detached from everything around oneself, including the struggles of living in a divided city. In order to give all stories, past, present, and future, the space they deserve, we need to start creating cities differently, with public space and architecture that creates and facilitates encounters between different people through shared rituals and activities. We need bold policymakers who recognize the power of diversity and inclusivity. We need visionary politicians from different backgrounds that are willing to listen to the stories of all of their citizens and are true representatives of those who they decide for. We need architects to create public space that connect people and that reflects shared history and possible futures. I invite you to walk the streets, write your own verse, and to open up to all the unknown stories of your fellow city dwellers. Thank you.
All right. So one of the things that happens with engagement is that everyone has a story. Everyone has a story. And everyone wants to share that story. And your job within your practice is really to try to figure out how best to capture those stories in a meaningful way that is useful. And so we went through a lot of information today, and sometimes folks' story is filled with a lot of, again, that historical harm and that trauma. And it's really important to be able to channel that information into your process, right? And so, one, you want to really be clear with what you're capturing in each part of your engagement so that you understand what part of the process you're in while you're collecting that information, right? And so, again, when you're dealing with community, you may be in charge of ensuring that the work continues to go forward. And leveraging the narrative canvas and the roadmap tool that I developed is a really great way to ensure that yourself as a practitioner is staying on track with your end goal. And so you definitely want to leverage people's narratives and their lived experience, but you want to use it in order to leverage it as a strategy that helps you identify barriers and opportunities in that existing system, right? It helps you investigate those challenges and successes that have happened within your target design area. And it helps you develop solutions that connect the dots between those barriers and opportunities, right? And you're doing all this in collaboration with the impacted community. But again, identifying barriers and investigating challenges and successes is different than developing solutions, right? So when you're identifying barriers and identifying those challenges and successes, you can have that conversation, right? You're collecting that information. And then you want to move on to, okay, now that we understand what those challenges are, what are some solutions that you can identify that can address those challenges? And you really want to get the impacted community to start, identifying those solutions. Some of them may want to continue to talk about those barriers, and that's fine. But you can say, oh yeah, that sounds like another great barrier. Let's go ahead and put that in that section, and let's go ahead and see if we're ready to move on to solutions, right? So you're really, again, trying to manage the progress of where the conversation is going. Because once you get those solutions, you're then going to be leveraging that information to inform the decision makers through policy proposals, design proposals, right? And structural changes, maybe a program that they can then put through that policy process, or, put funding behind to develop that program, or fund your design proposal, right? So again, understanding what part of the conversation you're having is critical. And who's playing what role in that conversation, because what may happen is your organization as a design firm, for example, may be the stakeholder that engages the decision makers, right? And that may be a meeting that's separate from the conversations you've been having with impacted communities. And so it's important for them to have confidence that you're taking their insight to the decision makers, and that the decision makers are going to develop a, initiative, or, fund the design that is most aligned to their vision as the end user. And then you want to evaluate the impact. Evaluating the impact by engaging those target demographic folks to figure that out, right? And so again, this is that flow. Identify the barriers and opportunities in the existing system, investigate those challenges and successes that are present in the community target area, develop solutions that connect the dots between barriers and opportunities, inform those decision makers through your design proposals, structural changes or programmatic recommendations, and then evaluate the results of the results by connecting with the impacted community, right? And that feedback loop, getting that narrative. When you're talking about the narrative, it's like, well, what's the narrative? How do I get the people to tell me what their issues are, right? But that information will be synthesized, because let's say you collect information from your target demographic group and you can only prioritize 2 or 3 things, but that information is still useful because it can be used in the future, right? So let's say you only have funding for the top 3 priorities, but let's say there may be funding in the future. So the work that you did to understand what 10 priorities are is still useful. You should still capture that information, right? And so how do we capture that information? We know how we keep the conversation on track and how we ensure that, you know, folks know what part of the process we're facilitating at that moment. Well, you leverage the narrative canvas, right? And this really helps navigate some of that lived experience folks are having and allows folks to express where they're coming from in relation to your design issue, right? So when we're talking about using the canvas, your design issue would, let's say, be at the top. When you say, let's say park equity, or let's say if it's site specific, it's, you know, what challenges are you having with accessing the site, right? This is an example that happened, that this tool was used in the urban agriculture working group that I facilitated. They were really working towards policy initiatives. So in that context, they identified the challenges through a few different ways. They connected with the public at large, and they also connected with the working group members, right? And so this right here shows that the different groups had similar responses. And so there were areas that were the same, which were highlighted in green. Both groups identified navigating systems as a priority, landscape access as a priority, cost of land as a priority as far as like it being an issue, economic opportunities as an issue, a challenge that they're facing. And so you see how they start to differ. On the left, they have lack of technical assistance, lack of financial assistance, lack of programmatic assistance, legal restrictions, institutional racism, need for storage, need for utilities. And you have lack of access, lack of conventional property development, unclear pathways towards assistance, soil contamination, lack of engaging collective narrative, missing education components, missing land management components, right? So again, this is a way that we were able to engage impacted folks, both through a public survey as well as direct engagement with the working group community, which was representative of, like, let's say 20 to 30 community-based organizations and leaders throughout Los Angeles who were interested in addressing urban agriculture issues. And so again, this insight was very helpful because it helped us prioritize where we were going to focus our policy issues, right? And where we're going to focus our policy priorities. So then what you do after you identify those challenges, you go to your solutions box. What is the disconnect? How do we address, how do we connect the dots? So in regards to navigating systems, you know, we'll talk more about this in the future, but the solutions is really about getting them to identify solutions that will address the challenges that they face. So just like we walked through collective impact and we work through each box one by one, we'll be doing this with this work as well. And so when we're talking about challenges, I want you to take some time. We'll take about 15 minutes to talk about the challenges that came up in the power of inclusive narrative. So this is going to be a separate assignment. And all you're going to do is talk about the challenges that have come up that were identified in regards to not providing inclusive narratives. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and put some music on and we could come back around, let's do 13 minutes and we'll come back at 8:20. And I want you all again to use the narrative canvas tool, like I explained how it was used, and identify what challenges are coming up in the Power of Inclusive Narrative video. Are there any questions that you all have in regards to the task that we'll be doing right now? All right. So the Canvas link should be updated with the module, and the lecture should be posted so that you can access the video. But we'll come back at 8:20. All right, so we should be coming back. Please give me a thumbs up if you're back with me. So that was just a quick exercise, just to give you an example of using the tool in real time. Just really identifying the challenges that are being brought up in a particular issue area. So we'll take a few share outs before we move on with the lecture of what challenges folks will identify from the video. What were some challenges that came up? Feel free to come off mute, write it in the chat, or raise your hand. Abdul, what were some challenges that came up that you were able to identify from the video? You might still be on mute, Abdul. I'm gonna go to Chase Gill. While we're waiting for you, Abdul, feel free to respond in the chat. Come off mute after Chase shares.
I would say challenge was being able to like connect the communities and try to figure out a thoughtful design that in a way hits all points on both sides, but also creates something that's meaningful.
Especially in cultural melting pots like Los Angeles, right? Where you have people from many cultures that come into public spaces and engage. And it's really unique, right? To share the experience of folks who may not have a history here in this country, but again, this is their home. And so there's certain elements. I know LA is really big on like, you know, Little Tokyo, I know here in Long Beach they have Cambodia Town, right? And there's elements and cultural practices and cultural significance that show up in the landscape, right? That are both significant to, let's say, other cultures and communities, but also um, immigrant communities and cultures, right? That are from other regions of the world, but now this is their home, right? And so really creating public domains that allow that expression and that uniqueness, whether that be through art, right? Or landscape architecture, different, let's say, landscape practices that bring the significance of home. Claudia, I see you put in the chat, some challenges were how to bring a design that makes people feel like they are in their home, because a lot of the cultures are bought from other countries. Exactly, right? So that's a big element. Sometimes they even have marketing or overheads and awnings of retail spaces that are in the languages, right, of these countries where there's a large stakeholder communities in certain parts of the city. So that's really great to see in the incorporation of those designs. A great example. Any other challenges that folks identify? Thanks for sharing, Claudia. Thanks for sharing, Chase. Let's go to Entree. And then Isaac Andrade, we'll go to you next. Entree, feel free to come off mute. We'll go to you, Isaac.
Sure. What I got is, of course, the lack of public places for people. I think overall it's very important for communities and cultures to be able to go out and feel welcomed.
And I see Melissa put something in the chat. Thank you, Melissa. She was challenged just by living in a foreign city in a different country. Culturally, she could not relate or feel she belonged in the new community. And because of this, she became an architect to be able to change exclusion into inclusion. She wanted to include various cultures and what was important to them. Cultural centers and bridges that one second. Centers and bridges that brought the community together regardless of religion. Awesome, Abdul. Thank you so much for dropping your response in the chat. But what I noticed was the lack of inclusivity, and that can create barriers for marginalized communities, making them feel disconnected and unable to contribute to or identify within the city around them. Really, really great challenges that you all brought up. Thank you so much for participating. All right, so we have a few more slides to get through. So again, that narrative canvas helps you identify a lot of factors. Well, first and foremost, those challenges, right? But it also allows you to identify the policy windows that are most relevant to your issue. It allows you to kind of frame your focus on identifying that. It helps you identify stakeholder vision and values, identify stakeholder issue priorities. It helps you develop a narrative and strategy for stakeholders. And it helps you identify champions and adversaries, right? There's folks that may be against you achieving the goals that you're trying to achieve. It may interfere with the way that they want to use the site, right? And so sometimes you are going to have to advocate against competing interests. But most importantly, it really does help you identify your target demographic, who is intended for your outcome, right? Those social outcomes, those economic outcomes, those political outcomes. Who are you trying to ensure is fully represented, fully participating, and fully benefiting from your intended outcome? And then you have that development of scope of work for your project and development for the implementation. So we're talking about opportunities to engage, right? So we're going to act like this says design development structure, right? All this is design stuff. We're going to act like it says design. So you really want to engage your impacted community, again, leveraging that narrative canvas tool and these, public engagement meetings, and develop those implementation strategies, get ideas for your designs, figure out what is the best way forward. But then you want to move those ideas into action. And oftentimes there's smaller groups that take on these more focused tasks. That task may be research, it may be meeting with other stakeholders, or it may be coming up with the design, right? But ultimately, all of that's going to lead to the policy implementation. And so your proposal, whatever that is, that comes from these discussions, then needs to be developed into a proposal. And that proposal then needs to be implemented, right? And so that goes back to what our guest speaker was talking about today, right? A lot of what he's doing right now is engaging the impacted community, moving the work into these sub-action categories, and then using that information to develop a design proposal that ultimately will be implemented by a design firm with funding that, eventually will be identified, right? But that implementation piece is critical because oftentimes folks get excited, they get a nice proposal done. They're like, whoa, we did it. We got a design proposal. And it's like, okay, well, now let's get it funded. Let's get it implemented, right? And that's a total different process. But it's critical to understand what is the infrastructure, what are the key points of engagement that you'll be conducting in order to get to this final proposal, right? So this is a framework for that. And I do see that Entree did respond to the chat. I'll go ahead and read this, no worries. My friend, okay, boom. I would say that some of the challenges that came up were the destruction of the bridge that connected the communities, causing a break within the memories of the community. These memories are what made the city feel special, and that's what almost brought the city its sense of community, indeed. And that's also the intervention that she used in her design project with recreating that bridge and the use of the bridge to jump and dive and creating that sense of community again. Thank you for sharing that, Entree. So in addition to understanding what this looks like, it's also important to ensure that, your engagement includes different practices, right? Like design charrettes to get folks engaged. You can have them develop a game plan, a strategic plan, and get stakeholders insight and input on those key areas of focus. And ensuring that all those takeaways you're able to incorporate and identify, right, where the source of information and insight came from and how that information was leveraged in your design. You also can use creative ways to get insight from the community, right? Let's say not everyone wants to do research, not everyone wants to research policy, not everyone wants to come up with solutions, right? But they may be able to identify those challenges and what they're experiencing through art, right? And so you can create workshops that allow folks to express themselves through art and then use that art as insight and information to then inform what your focus is going to be. This is a powerful art that was made by an artist named Mona Shalabi, and she really does a lot of environmental justice art. And this art really depicts the way that in California, Blacks and Hispanic folks are most impacted by air pollution that's inhaled, as you can see on the right. But on the left, this shows that air pollution is emitted by Black and brown folks at a lower rate. So although they're the ones most impacted, they're emitting air pollution at a much lower rate than their white counterparts. And so that's an interesting perspective that again is reflected through art. And so again, using different mediums to engage your target demographic group so that they can meaningfully participate in the process. And again, you can get useful information to inform your insight. So again, creative expression of narratives is a really good way to get folks to participate and share their lived experience. Lived experience is expertise, right? And so leveraging the lived experience of your impacted demographic allows them to, you know, participate with dignity, and then also leverage a lot of their experience as someone who's experiencing the community or experiencing the landscape on a more consistent basis than, let's say, a project designer is. Their wealth of expertise is super critical to achieving the most optimal project design and outcome. So what are some of the things that you want to consider? You want to account for the relevant historical harm of race-based policy in the intentional design exclusion in the built environment through quantitative and qualitative research. The information is out there, right? And so wherever your site is, you want to account for that, you know, and identify the policies or issues or programmatic gaps that are contributing to the challenges that are coming up. You also want to identify the relevant policy initiatives that align with your project goals and outcomes. So a lot of policies that have created the harm are historical policies. Many community plans, the general plan of a city, planning ordinances, many of those are like 30, 40, 50 years old. And so you think about so much has changed over the last 10 years, let alone 30 years or 20 years, right? So looking at how long a general plan, how long since it's been updated is a big thing, but there's oftentimes initiatives that are more recent, and you can use those as guides to inform, you know, what policy alignment you can pull from, let's say, the county. If the county has an initiative to plant 1,000 trees between now and 2030, you can, you know, build alignment around that initiative. There's different report documents, for example, like the Green New Deal at the city level and the Our County Plan at the county level here in LA, for example, that you can pull insight from. They did a lot of research with community-based organizations who are leading a lot of these efforts, and it gives you a lot of insight on what the county and the city is prioritizing in relation to green development, infrastructure priorities, and climate change effectiveness, right? And so really, again, identifying that alignment with existing policy initiatives that are current is a really good strategy to ensure that, you know, when you're promoting your designs, it's in alignment with what's happening locally. Also acknowledge how the historical harm has impacted social, academic, economic, and health, those social determinants of health, right? Which ways your design plans to intervene, right? So after you name that historical harm, if there's some facts around that, some data around that, you then want to talk about how your project is mitigating that harm. You want to allow impacted communities to collaborate, strategize, and lead policy and design development solutions happening around them. Engage in working groups, leveraging tools like the design charrettes, as we talked about, the narrative canvas, create opportunities through creative expression like art, dance, and theater, finding innovative funding to direct engagement to ensure best practice of compensating impacted communities. That's a big one. Hopefully you are working with organizations, companies, and entities that have funding for community engagement. Many times, you know, it can feel very extractive if there is no mechanism to ensure that the engagement process is not extractive, right? Making sure folks are compensated for their time, making sure that, again, this is another one that's on here, is identify contracting and employment opportunities where applicable to ensure economic opportunities for lived experience experts, right? So we're leveraging the community members to share their lived experience, which sometimes is very traumatic, right? So ensuring that it's not always this one-off, here's a gift card situation, but you're being thoughtful about creating economic opportunities, either through contracting, bringing artists on to facilitate workshops with the community. If it's about a park, making sure that, you know, you're working with folks that are from the local community in some capacity, with paid opportunities if you're in a position to advocate for that. So these are different ways that engagement can be facilitated and be very effective in the context of this. So just as I guess, insight, a lot of what we were talking about as far as site design strategies and site reading strategies came from Site Matters by Carol Burns and another author that I neglected to put here. But really a great book. And those site reading strategies are really informative. And yeah, definitely check out that book if you have not read it already. But yeah, that's all I have for you all today. I do want to mention I didn't have us break off to do too many questions today because we had a guest speaker. However, you do have some questions on Canvas that I want you all to respond to in relation to tonight's lecture. So we have a couple of guest speaker questions, some questions on site reading strategies, and then tools of engagement questions. The link for the lecture should be updated now. And so again, make sure you respond to these questions and upload them to the lecture link. And then also, I'm not sure if you all have noticed, but I have been posting the lectures from our class online. So make sure that you take a look at that. Each week is posted online onto YouTube. And so the link is posted in the announcements. So if you need to review the lecture or look back at it again, know that it's available in the announcements. All right, so any questions before I let you all go? Did y'all enjoy the lecture tonight? Awesome, awesome. All right, well, I will get this posted as soon as possible, but I really enjoyed y'all tonight in class. Make sure y'all complete the assignments and tasks. I've been getting some of them in. You're doing a really good job. Oh, I do want to mention, for last week's assignment, there were some challenges with it as far as like, I guess I would just say I didn't give the best instructions to be accountable on my end. But I will say that somebody did do it right. Let me see. Somebody did do it right. I gotta figure out who that was. think it was you, Dre. Shout out to Dre for completing the assignment, right? I'm gonna go ahead and share the screen. So what was intended was for you to look at the social, environmental, social, political, and social economic constraints and policy constraints that were identified, which all of you pretty much did pretty good. And then it seemed like most of you just identified the community vision, and then you identified different stakeholders, but did not identify their vision. And so the goal was to identify the stakeholder and then put their vision for these different categories, which you were able to do, Dre. Thank you so much. But I do want to give folks another opportunity to get this done. So what I did was I added a few extra columns of stakeholders for you to add, the stakeholders that you wanted to identify, because it was multiple. You need to only, give 2 or 3 examples, but community vision is important, right? All of this is about community center. So I already put that one there, but you can choose the other stakeholders, but I want you to identify their vision for social, environmental, socio-political, or socio-economic opportunity. Their vision or role, right? That's what we want to put in this area. But thank you, Dre, for completing this. And I see many of you did also upload the visual, right? And so right here, case study stakeholders visions, boom. You put that there nicely, Dre, thank you. And then you identified the concerns and constraints. So yeah, this is what I'm looking for. You can either do this conceptually to identify all of the things, right? Similar to what Dre did, or you can break it down by stakeholder. But I definitely want to see the PowerPoint visual along with that assignment, and you can upload both of these. So thank you, Dre, for doing that assignment right. Everybody else, please take another stab at it, get that assignment in, and make sure you complete both of the tasks. All right. All right, so that's all I have for y'all today. I'll be on for about 5 more minutes for anyone who needs to stay back and ask any questions. Melissa, if you can stay behind for a second.
Thank you, Professor.